Rain smeared the diner windows into oily streaks of neon pink and sickly yellow. De Juan didn't want to be here. His tailored coat smelled of damp asphalt and gunpowder entirely out of place among the chipped formica and stale grease. Beside him, 6-year-old Lily stared at the cracked sugar dispenser, utterly silent. She hadn't spoken a single word in 4 months. Then a scent cut through the burnt coffee-warm vanilla crush cedar underneath a layer of cheap dish soap. An Omega in a faded, ill-fitting apron approached their booth, gripping a stained notepad. Blood doesn't wash out a grout easily. De Juan knew this from professional experience, but lately he couldn't stop seeing rust-colored stains in the pristine white-tiled bathroom of his own estate. His mind was playing tricks on him. Guilt manifested as phantom smells. Copper-burnt cordite, the sickeningly sweet scent of gardenias from his late husband's funeral arrangements. He dug his fingernails into his palms, forcing himself back to the present. The diner smelled like none of those things. It smelled heavily of cheap industrial bleach, burnt hash browns, and the sour tang of damp wool from the few patrons huddled in the booths. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. The diner, a run-down metal tube squatting on the edge of the warehouse district, was a neutral zone. No one looked at him. No one cared about the bulge of the Glock 19 pressing hard against his ribs beneath his cashmere sweater. He looked across the sticky table. Lily was tracing the groove of a cigarette burn in the laminate. Her face was blank, her eyes hollow. She wore a bright yellow raincoat that felt like a mockery of her current state. 4 months ago, she had been a loud, messy, vibrant kid who demanded bedtime stories and screamed when her peas touched her mashed potatoes. Then the Rossi family made a play for the docks. A drive-by happened outside Lily's preschool, and the noise stopped. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't cried. She had simply powered down, retreating behind a wall of silence that no therapist specialist or bribe could penetrate. De Juan was failing her. He was a man who commanded 300 soldiers who dictated the import of narcotics across the eastern seaboard, yet he couldn't get a 6-year-old to ask for a glass of water. A heavy clatter dragged his attention toward the counter. A stack of ceramic plates had nearly toppled. The server caught them at the last second, letting out a sharp, breathless curse. De Juan watched the man. He was skinny. Not elegantly slender, but worn-down missed meals skinny. Ash-blonde hair hung in greasy, exhausted strands around pale cheeks. He wore a faded blue uniform shirt that was 2 sizes too big, and tied around his waist was a bright pink apron with the words "Starlight's #1 Waitress" embroidered in peeling white thread. The absurdity of it made De Juan's jaw tighten. A male Omega, clearly running on fumes, wearing a female hand-me-down uniform because the management was too cheap to order new ones. The server wiped his hands on the apron, grabbed a coffee pot, and started towards their booth. As he approached, De Juan's senses flared. Alpha biology was a crude, primitive thing, and De Juan spent a fortune on suppressants to keep his instincts locked in a cage. He needed a clear head to run his organization. But the suppressants couldn't entirely mask the sudden sharp spike of vanilla and crushed cedar. It wasn't the cloying artificial sweetness of high society Omegas who bathed in pheromone enhancers. This was raw. It smelled like sweat stress and natural heat fighting against cheap, over-the-counter blockers. "Oh, coffee?" the server asked. His voice was raspy, completely devoid of customer service cheer. His name tag was a piece of masking tape with Toby scrawled on it in Sharpie. "Black," De Juan grunted. He didn't look up at Toby's face. Eye contact with strangers often led to complications. Toby poured the sludge into a thick ceramic mug. Some of it splashed onto the saucer. He didn't apologize. Instead, he shifted his weight, his cheap sneakers squeaking against the linoleum, and looked down at Lily. "What about the kid?" Toby asked. "We got milk. We got apple juice that tastes like water. We got tap water that tastes like lead." Daejuan braced himself. This was the part he hated, the part where he had to speak for her, where he had to acknowledge her brokenness to a stranger. "Just bring her some milk." "Hey," Toby said. He didn't look at Daejuan. He was looking directly at Lily. Lily didn't blink. She kept tracing the cigarette burn. Toby leaned against the edge of the table. He didn't crouch down with a fake high-pitched voice like the child psychologist did. He just stood there smelling like grease and fatigue and tapped the end of his pen against his notepad. "You like pancakes, kid?" Toby asked. Daejuan's jaw clenched. "She doesn't talk." The words tasted like ash. "Just bring the milk." Toby ignored the Mafia boss. He leaned a fraction closer to Lily. "I hate them," Toby told her, his voice low, conspiratorial. "They get soggy. But the cook back there's Sal. He leaves them on the griddle too long so the edges get crispy. Almost burnt. Only good thing on the menu at 2 a.m. Lily's fingers stopped moving. She didn't look up, but the rhythmic tracing paused. "I'll put an order in," Toby muttered, straightening up. His spine cracked audibly. He looked at Daejuan for the first time. Toby's eyes were a dull, stormy gray, ringed with dark circles that spoke of insomnia and unpaid bills. He didn't flinch at Daejuan's hard glare. He just looked tired. "Milk and crispy pancakes. Be out in 10. He walked away. Daejuan watched the pink apron disappear behind the swinging doors of the kitchen. A strange, uncomfortable heat prickled at the base of Daejuan's skull. Disrespect. The Omega had ignored a direct command. In Daejuan's world, that got fingers broken. Here in the harsh, fluorescent hum of the diner, it just left him feeling entirely off balance. He looked at Lily. She was staring at the kitchen doors. The diner's heater kicked on, rattling violently, before spewing air that smelled faintly of burning dust. Daejuan checked his watch. 2:15 a.m. Outside his driver, Carmine was idling in the bulletproof SUV. Daejuan should be reviewing the ledger from the southern ports. He should be sleeping. Instead, he was sitting in a vinyl booth that was slowly leaching the warmth from his bones, watching his daughter stare at a set of swinging metal doors. 10 minutes later, Toby emerged. He was carrying a tray with one hand rubbing the back of his neck with the other. The scent of vanilla and cedar flared again, sharper, this time edged with the sour tang of physical pain. The Omega's arches were killing him. Daejuan could read the micro-expressions of discomfort, the slight drag of the left foot, the tightening of the lips. Toby slid a tall glass of milk onto the table, followed by a chipped plate. On it sat 3 pancakes. They were exactly as described, dark around the edges, irregular in shape, practically burnt. Daejuan frowned. He was used to perfection. Private chefs imported ingredients. This looked like garbage. Toby didn't walk away. He pulled a plastic squeeze bottle from the deep pocket of his ridiculous apron. It was filled with dark, thick syrup. Chocolate. "Almost forgot," Toby muttered. He didn't look at Lily's face. He just leaned over the table, bringing that scent of stressed vanilla suffocatingly close to Daejuan's face, and aimed the nozzle at the top pancake. Toby's hand was shaking slightly. a faint tremor of exhaustion. He squeezed the bottle. A thick dark brown line oozed onto the pale surface of the pancake. Toby moved his hand deliberately, dragging the nozzle down, curving it, then looping back up. He drew a heart. It wasn't a perfect symmetrical shape. The right side was slightly lopsided, the bottom point pooled too thickly because of his trembling hand. It was sloppy. It was deeply imperfect. "There," Toby said, wiping a drip from the nozzle with his thumb and licking it off without thinking. "Chef's special." He shoved the bottle back into his apron, pulled a napkin from the dispenser, and turned to walk away. He didn't wait for a thank you. He didn't wait to see if the silent, creepy kid would smile. He was just a guy on his 12th hour of a shift performing a road action to get through the night. DeJuan reached for his wallet, intending to throw down a 50 and leave. The sight of the lopsided chocolate heart irritated him. It was a pathetic gesture, a cheap, saccharine attempt at what kindness? There was no kindness in DeJuan's world. Kindness was a liability. It got your throat cut. A sound stopped him. It was a tiny, sharp intake of breath. DeJuan's head snapped toward his daughter. Lily was staring at the pancake. Her small hands, which had been resting limply in her lap for 4 agonizing months, slowly raised. She gripped the edge of the table. Her knuckles went white. She stared at the lopsided chocolate heart, and then a sound vibrated in her throat. A wet, broken hiccup. DeJuan froze. His lungs stopped expanding. The ambient noise of the diner, the hum of the fridge, the rattle of the heater, the distant siren faded into a muffled roar. Lily reached out with a trembling index finger. She didn't pick up her fork. She pressed her finger directly into the thick pool of chocolate syrup at the bottom of the heart. The dark liquid stained her pale skin. She pulled her finger back and stared at it. Then she looked up, not at DeJuan. She looked past him, her dark eyes tracking the faded blue shirt and the ridiculous pink apron of the retreating server. Sloppy," she whispered. The word was cracked hoarse from disuse, barely louder than the hum of the fluorescent lights. But to DeJuan, it was a gunshot. It was a bomb detonating in the small, greasy confines of the diner. He couldn't breathe. His hands gripped the edge of the table so hard the laminate groaned. He stared at his daughter, terror and violent relief warring in his chest. He wanted to grab her, pull her into his chest, and never let go. He wanted to weep, but he didn't. He was a stone. He couldn't show weakness. Lily slowly put her chocolate-stained finger in her mouth. She tasted it, her brow furrowed. Cold. 2 words. DeJuan's vision blurred. The edges of the diner darkened. The scent of the Omega vanilla cedar sweat suddenly felt less like an intrusion and more like an anchor tying him to reality. Toby was wiping down the counter across the room. He hadn't heard. He was just scrubbing furiously at a stubborn coffee stain. His shoulders slumped completely oblivious to the tectonic plates shifting inside DeJuan's universe. DeJuan dropped a $100 bill onto the table. It was crisp, fresh from an ATM alien in this grime. He didn't wait for Lily to eat. The spell felt too fragile. If they stayed, the silence might rush back in to fill the void. "Come on, Lily," he said, his voice grating and unsteady. She didn't fight him. She slid out of the booth, her eyes lingering on the plate. DeJuan wrapped his heavy wool coat around her tiny shoulders to shield her from the rain. As he pushed the diner doors open, the bell chimed a sharp, metallic sound. Toby glanced up from his scrubbing. He saw the $100 bill sitting next to the uneaten cold pancakes. He frowned, shaking his head. Rich assholes, always wasting food. He grabbed his rag and walked over to bust the table. Outside in the suffocating luxury of the armored SUV, Dewan held his daughter. She smelled like wet rain gear and faint artificial chocolate. She didn't speak again on the ride home, but the dead vacant stare was gone. In its place was a quiet, confused contemplation. Dewan leaned his head against the cold glass of the window, watching the city blur past. His heart beat a frantic, dangerous rhythm against his ribs. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on the best medical minds on the East Coast. Nothing worked. A sleep-deprived Omega in a Waitress apron had drawn a messy heart with cheap syrup, and his daughter had spoken. Dewan closed his eyes. The scent of vanilla lingered in his sinuses. It felt like a warning. It took 4 days for the desperation to override Dewan's logic. 4 days of sitting in his sprawling, empty mansion, watching Lily regress. The morning after the diner, she had hummed a disjointed tune while brushing her teeth. By Tuesday evening, the silence had crept back in thick and suffocating. She stopped looking at people. She stopped reacting to the television. The brief spark of life ignited by cold chocolate syrup was dying out smothering under the weight of her trauma. Dewan couldn't let it die. It was Friday night, 10 o'clock. The rain had returned, turning the city into a blurred smear of grays and blacks. Dewan told Carmine to drive to the warehouse district. Carmine, a massive alpha with a scar splitting his left eyebrow, didn't question the order, though his heavy silence spoke volumes. The boss returning to a civilian diner in unaligned territory was a security nightmare. Dewan didn't care. When he pushed open the glass doors of Starlight Diner, the bell chimed, but the atmosphere inside was drastically different from Tuesday night. The Friday crowd was rougher. Truckers coming off long hauls, dock workers drinking cheap beer from paper bags hidden under the tables, loud, aggressive energy bouncing off the cheap metal walls. The air was thick with sour alpha pheromones, aggression, territorial posturing, cheap cologne. Dewan's own aura flared defensively. He clamped down on it, pulling Lily tighter against his leg. He scanned the room. No pink apron. A knot of irrational anger tightened in his gut. Where was he? Then a crash echoed from the far corner. A glass shattering. Dewan's hand drifted instinctively toward his ribs. He moved toward the sound, weaving through the crowded tables. In the back corner booth, a massive bearded alpha in a flannel shirt was standing up, his face red, his breath visibly stinking of gin. And standing across from him, trapped between the table and the wall, was Toby. He was wearing the same faded blue shirt, the same ridiculous Sally's Best Waitress apron. But he didn't look tired today. He looked feral. I said another beer. The drunk alpha slurred, slamming his heavy hand onto the table, rattling the silverware. And I said we don't serve alcohol, man, Toby snapped back. His voice wasn't a soothing Omega purr. It was abrasive, loud grating. You brought that in yourself, and you're spilling it on my floor. Pay your tab and get out. The alpha's eyes narrowed. The scent of burnt ozone and rotting fruit, angry alpha pheromones flooded the immediate area. Several patrons at nearby tables hastily stood up and moved away. Dewan stopped 10 feet away, his muscles coiling. He should step in. It would take him exactly 4 seconds to break the drunk's windpipe and drop him to the floor. But he held back. He wanted to see what the Omega would do. Watch your mouth, sweetheart, the drunk sneered, reaching across the table. His thick, meaty fingers clamped down hard on Toby's left wrist. De Juan felt a sudden, violent spike of adrenaline. His vision tinted red at the edges. Mine, a dark, primitive part of his brain hissed. He forced it down. This Omega was nothing to him. A tool. A means to an end for Lily. Toby didn't scream. He didn't cower. His face twisted in a snarl of pure, unfiltered fury. With his free hand, he grabbed the heavy, thick-bottomed glass sugar dispenser from the table. "Don't touch me," Toby hissed, and he slammed the base of the sugar dispenser directly down onto the Alpha's knuckles. A wet crack cut through the diner's ambient noise. The drunk howled, releasing Toby's wrist and stumbling backward, clutching his hand. Sugar rained down onto the sticky linoleum, sparkling under the harsh fluorescent lights like shattered glass. Toby didn't retreat. He stood his ground, chest heaving, holding the heavy glass dispenser by the neck like a club. He was shaking violently, his cheap scent blockers completely failing. The diner was suddenly saturated with the scent of terrified, defensive vanilla. It was a chaotic, messy display. He wasn't poised. He wasn't a trained fighter. He was a cornered animal making do with what he had. "Sal!" Toby screamed over his shoulder toward the kitchen, his voice cracking. "Call the cops. The guy in booth 4 is trespassing." The threat of law enforcement was enough. The drunk Alpha cursed, spitting blood onto the floor, and shoved his way past the gawking patrons fleeing into the rainy night. The diner fell into a tense, buzzing silence. Toby stood frozen by the table for a long moment. Then with a shuddering breath, he lowered the sugar dispenser. He looked down at his left wrist. It was already turning a mottled, ugly purple. De Juan felt a cold fury settle into his bones. Not at Toby. At the drunk. At the world. Toby looked up, his gray eyes sweeping the crowd, and locked onto De Juan. He blinked, the adrenaline haze slowly clearing. He saw De Juan's imposing frame, the expensive coat, the cold deadpan expression. Then his eyes dropped to the little girl standing by his leg. Toby blew out a breath, a strand of greasy blonde hair fluttering away from his forehead. He didn't look grateful for an audience. He just looked exhausted all over again. He bent down, grabbed a dirty rag off the table, and started to wipe up the spilled gin and sugar favoring his bruised wrist. "You're back," Toby muttered as De Juan approached the booth. He didn't look up. "We don't serve miracles on Fridays, just meatloaf." De Juan stood over him. The proximity was overwhelming. The Omega's distress scent was fading, replaced by the dull ache of pain and deep, bone-weary resignation. "Let me look at your wrist," De Juan said. His voice was deeper than he intended, a low rumble that vibrated in his chest. It was an alpha command wrapped in a suggestion. Toby scoffed, wiping harder at the sticky table. "I'm fine. Minimum wage doesn't cover medical leave. I've got 5 more hours." He winced as his thumb brushed against the swelling joint. Suddenly, a small, yellow-sleeved arm reached out. Lily walked past De Juan. She stepped right up to the booth, her tiny boots crunching on the spilled sugar. She stopped next to Toby. Toby froze the rag motionless in his good hand. He looked down at the silent, dark-haired girl. Lily stared at his bruised wrist. She reached into her yellow raincoat pocket. She pulled out a small, slightly crushed packet of wet wipes, the kind De Juan carried in the car for spills. She held it out to Toby. Toby stared at the packet, then at Lily's blank face. He slowly reached out with his uninjured hand and took it. "Thanks, kid," Toby said softly. The abrasive, grating edge to his voice was entirely gone. It was replaced by a gentle, raspy warmth that made the hair on Dejuan's arms stand up. Lily didn't retreat. She stood right next to Toby's leg. She reached out with her small hand and lightly touched the faded pink fabric of his ridiculous waitress apron. Then, looking up at Toby's face, she opened her mouth. "Hurt," she whispered. The diner continued to buzz around them. Plates clattered. The fry cook yelled an order. But in that small corner booth, time stopped. Toby's breath hitched. He looked from Lily to Dejuan, his gray eyes wide, reading the desperate, barely contained shock on the Mafia boss's face. Toby realized in that split second the gravity of what was happening. This kid was broken, and somehow he was the glue. Toby swallowed hard. He slowly crouched down, ignoring the shooting pain in his wrist, putting himself at eye level with the little girl. The pink apron pooled around his knees on the dirty floor. "Yeah, kid," Toby said, giving her a crooked, tired smile that didn't reach his eyes, but carried a heavy, authentic truth. "It hurts a little bit, but I'll be okay." Lily nodded slowly. She moved half a step closer, burying her face against the soft, faded cotton of Toby's shoulder, right where the vanilla scent was strongest. Dejuan watched his traumatized daughter willingly seek comfort from a stranger. He watched the Omega awkwardly, hesitantly bring his good arm up to gently pat her back. Dejuan's hands curled into tight fists. He was a man who solved problems with violence and money. He couldn't buy this. He couldn't threaten it into existence. This fragile, unpredictable connection was the only thing keeping his daughter tethered to reality. He looked at Toby's bruised wrist, at the cheap, too-large shirt, at the exhausted slope of his neck. Dejuan realized with a terrifying absolute certainty that he was no longer a free man. He was bound to this neon-lit, grease-stained diner. He was bound to this deeply flawed, cynical Omega. "Take off the apron," Dejuan ordered, his voice slicing through the warm moment like a blade. Toby looked up, his jaw tightening defensively. "Excuse me." "Take off the apron. Your shift is over," Dejuan stated. It wasn't a request. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick wad of bills, dropping it onto the sticky table. It was more than Toby made in a month. "I need a private chef for my daughter. The position starts tonight." Toby stared at the money, then up at the cold, imperious Alpha. He gently pulled back from Lily, his expression hardening. "I'm not a chef," Toby said flatly. "I pour coffee and I draw messy hearts with cheap syrup. I don't work for suits who think they can buy people." Dejuan stepped closer, his heavy presence looming over the crouched Omega. He leaned down, his voice dropping to a dangerous, desperate whisper meant only for Toby. "I am not asking you to cook." Dejuan said, the terrifying vulnerability of a broken father bleeding through his icy facade. "I am asking you to save her, and I will pay you whatever you want." Toby's left sneaker squeaked against the imported Carrara marble floor. It was a sharp, pathetic sound that echoed all the way up to the vaulted ceiling of the foyer. He stopped walking. He looked down at his shoes. They were gray, though they used to be white, and the sole of the left one was peeling away. Then he looked up at the sweeping double staircase, the crystal chandelier that probably cost more than his entire bloodline would ever earn, and the massive, unsmiling Alpha blocking the hallway. Carmine had patted him down at the front gates with the rough efficiency of a cop checking a known felon. Toby had nothing on him but a cheap duffel bag containing 3 T-shirts, a bottle of ibuprofen, and a half-empty pack of generic scent blockers. "Keep moving," Carmine grunted. Toby hiked the strap of the duffel bag higher on his shoulder. His sprained wrist throbbed with a sickening heavy rhythm. "Don't rush me, Lurch. I'm taking in the sheer suffocating lack of personality." Carmine's jaw locked his alpha pheromone, spiking a smell like burnt rubber and damp earth. Toby didn't flinch. He just chewed on the inside of his cheek, letting his own sour, stressed vanilla scent bleed through his cheap blockers. He was exhausted. He was terrified. But mostly he was deeply, profoundly annoyed. Dejuan appeared at the top of the stairs. He wore a dark charcoal suit that fit him like a second skin, completely at odds with the fact that it was 3 a.m. He looked less like a father who had just brought his traumatized daughter home, and more like a CEO about to order a hostile takeover. "Carmine, step back," Dejuan ordered. His voice didn't carry volume, but it carried weight. Carmine retreated into the shadows of the hallway. Dejuan descended the stairs. He didn't look at Toby's cheap clothes or the muddy footprints the sneakers were leaving on the pristine stone. "Her room is down the east hall. 3rd door. The medical staff has cleared out for the night." "You have medical staff on standby?" Toby asked, his voice raspy. "For a kid who won't talk." "I have everything on standby," Dejuan said flatly. "Except a clue," Toby muttered. He pushed past the Mafia boss, his shoulder deliberately brushing against Dejuan's silk tie. It was a stupid, petty act of rebellion, but Toby needed it. He needed to prove he wasn't just another piece of furniture being bought and placed in this mausoleum. As Toby walked down the impossibly long, silent hallway, the air felt heavy. The house smelled a lemon pledge ozone from high-end air purifiers and a faint lingering ghost of something floral, maybe orchids. It didn't smell like a home. It smelled like a museum exhibit of a home. He found the 3rd door and pushed it open. Lily's room was an explosion of pastel pinks and creams. It looked exactly like a display window in an expensive boutique. A mountain of stuffed animals sat untouched in the corner. An easel with fresh, unused paints stood by the window. Lily was sitting in the middle of a massive, fluffy rug. She was still wearing her yellow raincoat over her pajamas. She was staring at the blank wall. Toby dropped his duffel bag by the door. It hit the hardwood with a dull thud. Lily didn't flinch. He didn't walk over and crouch down. He didn't offer a gentle smile. He walked to the opposite side of the rug, groaned loudly as his knees popped, and sat down cross-legged on the floor. He dug his good hand into his jeans pocket and pulled out a battered rubber-banded deck of playing cards. They were sticky from diner syrup and smelled vaguely of stale cigarette smoke. He slipped the rubber band off with his teeth. "I hate this house," Toby said out loud. His voice was casual, directed at the floorboards. "It echoes. Makes my head hurt worse than it already does." He began to clumsily shuffle the cards with one hand, letting them bridge and fall in a messy, uneven pile. "And your dad," Toby continued, laying out a sloppy row of cards for a game of solitaire. "Your dad wears a suit in the middle of the night. That's serial killer behavior, kid. I'm just saying." A red 7 on a black 8. "The guy at the diner broke my wrist," Toby said, his voice dropping a fraction, losing the sarcastic edge. "It throbs every time my heart beats. It's loud. The throbbing." He paused, holding a black king. He didn't look up. He just stared at the worn paper of the card. The fabric of the yellow raincoat rustled. Toby didn't move. He breathed in, catching the faint, artificial chocolate scent still clinging to her. A small shadow fell over his layout. Lily sat down directly across from him. She pulled her knees to her chest. She stared at the cards. Slowly, she reached out a tiny finger and tapped the black king in Toby's hand, then pointed to an empty space on the rug. Toby swallowed the hard lump in his throat. He placed the king on the empty spot. Yeah, good catch. Needs to go there. They didn't speak again for 2 hours. They just sat on the floor of a fortress, moving sticky pieces of cardboard, while a mob boss stood in the pitch-black hallway outside the cracked door listening to the silence break. The kitchen was a joke. It was a massive stainless steel operating room disguised as a place to cook. 6-burner industrial stove. 2 separate islands topped with seamless black granite. A refrigerator the size of Toby's entire apartment. It was 7 a.m. Toby was running on exactly 0 minutes of sleep. He stood in front of the espresso machine, glaring at it. It had gauges, levers, and digital readouts. It looked like it required a pilot's license. "Just give me hot bean water, you metallic bastard," Toby whispered, pressing a random silver button. The machine hissed violently, shooting a jet of high-pressure steam directly at his chest. Toby cursed, stumbling back. He slipped on the polished floor, catching his weight on the edge of the granite island with his left hand. White-hot pain shot up his arm from his bruised wrist. He gasped, his knees buckling slightly, and gripped his left forearm, squeezing his eyes shut. "Don't break the machinery. It was imported from Milan." Toby snapped his head up. Dejuan was standing in the archway. He was dressed in a fresh suit, navy blue this time, looking entirely rested, though Toby knew the Alpha hadn't slept either. Dejuan's eyes were dark, tracking the way Toby hunched over his injured wrist. "Go to hell," Toby ground out, turning his back on the Alpha. He walked over to the massive refrigerator, yanked the heavy door open, and stared blindly at the contents. Rows of glass-bottled water. Tupperware containers holding prepped exotic-looking greens. Trays of raw marbled meat. "Where's the normal food?" Toby demanded, grabbing a perfect shiny red apple. "Where's the bread?" "The peanut butter in the pantry," Dejuan said. His footsteps were completely silent against the tile as he walked into the kitchen. "The chef usually handles breakfast." "I thought I was the chef," Toby mocked. He grabbed a heavy forged steel chef's knife from the magnetic block on the wall. It was perfectly balanced, razor-sharp, and far too heavy for a man with a sprained wrist. Toby set the apple on the cutting board. He tried to grip the handle tightly, but his swollen fingers refused to close all the way. His hand trembled. "Put the knife down," Dejuan said. His voice was suddenly closer. The Alpha had moved across the room with unnatural speed. "I'm making her a snack," Toby snapped. He brought the blade down. Because his grip was weak, the blade twisted. It glanced off the slick skin of the apple and sliced cleanly into the fleshy part of Toby's left index finger. "Shit!" Toby dropped the knife. It clattered loudly against the granite. Blood welled up instantly, thick and bright red, dripping down his skin and pooling on the pristine white cutting board. Before Toby could grab a towel, a heavy hand clamped down on his right shoulder, spinning him around. Dejuan was right there. He was so close that Toby could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could feel the heat radiating off the Alpha's massive frame. The air in the kitchen abruptly changed. Dejuan's suppressants were top-tier, chemically binding his alpha pheromones. But the sudden scent of an injured Omega, the metallic tang of blood mixed with the spiked, panicky smell of crushed cedar, was a biological trigger. Dejuan's nostrils flared. The muscles in his jaw ticked. For a split second, the polished icy facade shattered. Toby saw the animal underneath. He felt the heavy, suffocating pressure of an alpha's territorial dominance pressing down on his lungs, smelling of crisp winter air and sharp, burnt gunpowder. Toby's breath hitched. His Omega instinct screamed at him to bare his neck, to submit, to let the stronger predator take over. Instead, Toby shoved his bleeding hand directly toward De Juan's chest. "Back off," Toby snarled, his voice shaking. De Juan blinked. The red haze in his eyes receded, locking back behind the walls of discipline. He didn't back off, but he didn't attack. He looked down at the bleeding finger. Without a word, De Juan reached out. His large, scarred hands that had snapped necks and signed death warrants, gently caught Toby's wrist. His touch was shockingly warm. Toby flinched, trying to pull away, but De Juan's grip was iron. "Stop moving," De Juan commanded softly. He reached over with his free hand, grabbed a pristine white linen towel from the counter, and wrapped it tightly around Toby's bleeding finger, pressing down to staunch the flow. Toby stared at the top of De Juan's dark head. They were standing inches apart in the sterile kitchen. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. "I could have done it," Toby whispered aggressively, hating the way his voice trembled, hating how small he felt next to the alpha. "You are a liability," De Juan said, not looking up. He applied more pressure to the cut. "You're sleep-deprived, injured, and reckless. Then fire me." De Juan finally looked up. His dark eyes met Toby's dull gray ones. The proximity was electric, a live wire snapping between them. "No," De Juan said. His voice was a low rumble in his chest. "Lily ate half a piece of toast an hour ago. She pointed at the pantry until Carmine opened it. She didn't speak, but she engaged." De Juan slowly released his grip on Toby's hand, leaving the blood-soaked linen wrapped securely around the finger. He stepped back, the cold distance instantly returning. "You don't cook," De Juan stated, turning his back to grab the heavy chef's knife off the counter. He wiped the blade clean with another towel. "You sit with her. You play cards. You drop things and complain. I will handle the food." Toby stood frozen, clutching his bandaged hand to his chest. He watched in bewildered silence as the most feared man in the city took the shiny red apple, expertly halved it, cored it, and began slicing it into perfect, uniform, paper-thin wedges. "Sloppy," Toby muttered under his breath, repeating Lily's word from the diner. De Juan's knife paused for a fraction of a second against the cutting board. He didn't turn around, but Toby saw the rigid set of the alpha's shoulders drop just a millimeter. "Take the apple to the living room," De Juan ordered, sliding the slices onto a porcelain plate. "And tell Carmine to show you how to use the espresso machine before you blow up my kitchen." The greenhouse in the east wing smelled like wet earth and rotting orchids. It was a humid, glass-enclosed purgatory that De Juan's late husband had built and De Juan had subsequently ignored. The heating vents hissed a steady stream of damp air, making the condensation drip heavily down the panes. Toby sat cross-legged on the terracotta floor. His gray sneakers were caked in potting soil. Across from him, Lily dug a plastic yellow trowel into a bag of expensive organic compost. It had been 6 days. 6 days of living in a museum, eating food prepared by a Michelin star chef, who looked deeply offended every time Toby asked for ketchup, and sleeping on a mattress that cost more than a car. And Toby was crashing. The generic scent blockers he bought at the corner bodega were meant for Omegas living relatively stress-free lives. They weren't designed to withstand the ambient heavy alpha pheromones of a heavily guarded Mafia compound. nor were they meant to mask the severe sleep deprivation and malnutrition Toby had been ignoring for months. A drop of sweat stung Toby's eye. He wiped it away with the back of a dirty hand. His skin felt too tight. A low, dull ache radiated from the base of his spine, pulsing in time with his erratic heartbeat. "Okay, kid," Toby rasped. His throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. "You bury the bulb pointing up, I think. If it's upside down, it grows to China. That's science." Lily didn't look up. She meticulously scooped a small pile of dirt, her tiny fingers completely black, and dumped it into a ceramic pot. She hadn't spoken since the diner. The silence had returned thick and unyielding, but the catatonic staring was gone. She was present. She just refused to make a sound. Toby leaned forward to grab another bulb, but his vision swam. The terracotta floor tilted sharply to the left. He caught himself with his hands burying his fingers into the loose soil spilled across the tiles. His breathing turned shallow. The smell of the wet earth violently twisted in his stomach. His cheap blockers were failing. He could smell it, his own scent. Typically, a muted vanilla and cedar was souring into something hot, frantic, and cloyingly sweet. The precursor to a stress-induced fever. He needed to get out of the greenhouse. He needed to get to his room, lock the door, and ride out the crash in the dark. Toby wheezed, trying to push himself up. His legs felt like lead pipes. "Hey, we're done. Gotta go inside." Lily placed the yellow trowel on the floor. She looked at him. Her dark eyes widened slightly. Toby managed to get one knee under himself before a wave of intense nausea hit him. He slumped back against the metal leg of a heavy planning table, his chest heaving. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing the heels of his hands against his temples. "Just give me a minute," he mumbled to the empty air. He didn't hear the greenhouse door open. He didn't hear footsteps. The first indication that they weren't alone was the sudden suffocating wall of winter air and burnt gunpowder. Toby dragged his eyes open. Dewan stood in the doorway. He was wearing a casual gray sweater, but the relaxed clothing didn't soften the rigid, dangerous line of his jaw. The Alpha's eyes instantly locked onto Toby, then darted to Lily. "What is this?" Dewan demanded, stepping into the humid air. He stopped 10 feet away. The muscles in his neck were tight. His nostrils flared. He could smell it. "Gardening," Toby slurred. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a wet cough. "Building character through dirt." Dewan didn't look amused. He looked furious. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, his heavy boots crunching on spilled soil. He didn't look at Lily. He crouched directly in front of Toby, invading his space entirely. "You're running a fever," Dewan said. It wasn't a question. He reached out his large hand, completely enveloping Toby's clammy, dirt-streaked forehead. The contrast of the Alpha's cool, dry skin against his burning forehead made Toby flinch. He weakly tried to swat Dewan's hand away. "I'm fine, just tired. Need to lie down." "Your blockers are failing," Dewan stated flatly, ignoring Toby's weak resistance. He pulled his hand back, wiping a smear of potting soil from his thumb onto his expensive slacks. "You reek of distress. It's flooding the entire wing." Toby's cheeks burned a mix of fever and intense humiliation. "Sorry to pollute your air quality. I'll just go spray some Lysol in my room." He grabbed the edge of the planning table and hauled himself up. His vision blacked out at the edges. His knees immediately buckled. He didn't hit the floor. Dewan caught him. A heavy, unyielding arm wrapped around Toby's waist, hauling him flush against a solid chest. Toby gasped. The proximity was overwhelming. The pure, unfiltered alpha scent hit Toby's system like a physical blow short-circuiting his panicked omega instincts. The frantic sweetness in his own scent momentarily dialed back forcibly, leveled by the sheer dominance of the alpha holding him. "Let go of me." Toby ground out, his voice shaking. He hated this. He hated being weak. He hated relying on a man who bought people to fix his problems. "Stop fighting," Dewan ordered softly, right next to Toby's ear. "You are not leaving this room under your own power. You'll crack your skull on the marble." Dewan adjusted his grip easily, lifting Toby off the ground as if he weighed nothing. Toby squeezed his eyes shut, his face burning, burying his nose into the collar of Dewan's sweater to hide from the humiliation. A sharp tug on Dewan's pant leg made them both freeze. Dewan looked down. Lily stood there. She held the dirty plastic trowel in one hand. With the other, she was clutching the fabric of Dewan's trousers. She looked up at her father, then at the limp, sweating Omega in his arms. She dropped the trowel. It clattered loudly on the tiles. Slowly, deliberately, Lily reached out and patted Toby's dangling sneaker. Dewan stared at his daughter's mud-stained hand, resting on the cheap gray canvas. His chest tightened a strange, uncomfortable pressure, building behind his ribs. "He's going to be fine," Dewan told his daughter. His voice was rough, unpracticed in the art of reassurance. "I'm taking him to the doctor." He turned and carried Toby out of the humid glass cage, leaving muddy footprints tracking across the pristine floors of his estate. The study was a heavy room lined with dark mahogany shelves and smelling permanently of aged scotch and cigar ash. It was a room designed for intimidation. 3 days had passed since the greenhouse. Toby had spent 2 of them locked in his room, sleeping off the fever and adjusting to the medical-grade suppressants Dewan's private physician had aggressively prescribed. The new pills were tiny and white. They didn't just mask his scent. They muted everything. The dull ache in his wrist faded. The constant thrumming anxiety in his chest went entirely quiet. He felt dangerously calm. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Toby walked down the east hallway, holding a glass of apple juice. He was wearing a fresh pair of sweatpants and a gray t-shirt clothes Carmine had silently dropped outside his door, entirely too expensive and entirely devoid of any diner logos. He was looking for Lily. As he approached the study, he noticed the heavy double doors were slightly ajar. Low, murmuring voices drifted into the hallway. "The Port Authority is asking questions, Dewan. The manifest didn't match the cargo on the docks." Toby stopped. He took a sip of the juice. He should turn around. The calm, muted part of his brain told him that listening to Mafia business was a very quick way to end up buried under a new highway. But then he heard another voice, rough grating and thickly arrogant. "We need to send a message to the Rossi crew. They're getting bold. And frankly, Dom, you've been distracted, hiding out in this fortress, playing nursemaid to a mute kid and some stray Omega you pulled out of the gutter." The air in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. Toby stepped closer to the crack in the doors. He couldn't help it. Inside, Dewan sat behind a massive desk. Carmine stood perfectly still by the window. Sitting in a leather wingback chair opposite the desk was a heavily built alpha in a pinstripe suit. He had a thick neck and a smug expression. Dewan didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting flat on the polished mahogany. His eyes were dead, Victor Dewan said. The name tasted like poison. His voice was incredibly quiet, lacking any of the forceful timbre he used when irritated. It was a terrifying sound. You are speaking about my daughter. Victor leaned back, waving a dismissive hand. Come on, Dom. I'm just saying what the capos are thinking. You're soft right now. We need the boss back on the street, not playing house with damaged goods. Toby's grip tightened on the glass of apple juice. The muted calm of the suppressants violently fractured. Damaged goods. Before Toby could move, a small shape darted past his legs. Lily pushed through the heavy doors. She had a sketchbook clutched to her chest. She didn't look at Victor. She didn't look at Carmine. She marched straight toward the massive desk, her tiny boots entirely silent on the thick Persian rug. Dewan's cold, dead expression shattered the instant he saw her. He sat up straighter, the terrifying stillness vanishing. Lily, you shouldn't be in here. Victor stopped talking. He looked down at the little girl, a sneer curling his upper lip. Right on cue. Look, Dom, have the nanny take her out. We're talking business. Lily stopped walking. She was standing exactly halfway between Victor's chair and Dewan's desk. She slowly turned her head and looked directly at Victor. The heavy alpha glared back at her, his pheromones spiking a nasty, aggressive scent of sour beer and ozone. It was a deliberate attempt to intimidate a child. Toby didn't think. The suppressants didn't matter. The danger didn't matter. He pushed the doors wide open. Hey! Toby barked, his voice loud and raspy, shattering the tense silence of the study. Every eye in the room snapped to him. Carmine's hand twitched toward his suit jacket. Victor frowned, looking the skinny gray-clad Omega up and down. Toby didn't look at the mobsters. He walked straight across the room, his bare feet sinking into the rug, and stopped directly in front of Lily. He physically placed himself between the little girl and Victor, blocking the capo's line of sight. Juice break is over, kid, Toby said, his voice dropping to a casual, bored drawl. He handed Lily the half-empty glass. Let's go find the dog with the ugly face on the TV. Victor stood up. He was massive, easily towering over Toby. The aggressive alpha scent thickened, making the air hard to breathe. Who the hell are you to interrupt a sit-down? Toby didn't flinch. He slowly looked up at Victor. His gray eyes were entirely unimpressed. I'm the guy who thinks you smell like a wet trash can. Sit down before you stroke out. The room went dead silent. Victor's face flushed a dark, angry purple. He took a step forward, raising a heavy, ring-covered hand. You little... A sharp, metallic clack echoed through the room. Victor froze. Toby looked past the capo's shoulder. Dewan had stood up from his desk. In his right hand, he held a sleek black semi-automatic pistol. The safety was off. He wasn't pointing it at Victor. He was simply holding it, the barrel resting against the edge of the mahogany desk. The casualness of the gesture was horrifying. Dewan's face was a mask of carved stone. His dark eyes were locked on Victor. The alpha pheromones rolling off the boss weren't just aggressive. They were lethal. They smelled like freezing rain and copper blood. Victor Dewan said. The quiet was back. If you take another step toward them, I'll put a bullet through your knee. And then I will ask you to apologize. Victor swallowed hard. His angry flush drained away, leaving a sickly pallor. He slowly lowered his hand and took a very deliberate step backward. Dom! Victor stammered, his eyes glued to the gun. It was just a misunderstanding. Get out of my house, Dewan stated. Victor didn't argue. He turned and practically ran for the doors, disappearing into the hallway. Carmine remained perfectly still by the window, his face impassive, but his eyes tracked the boss. Dewan slowly engaged the safety on the pistol. Click. He set it down on the desk. He looked at Toby, who was still standing directly in front of Lily, his shoulders rigid, a physical shield. Toby looked back at Dewan. He looked at the gun. He looked at the man who had just casually threatened to maim a colleague. The reality of the situation crashed over Toby. He wasn't in a rich man's house. He was in the center of a cartel. Toby took a slow, unsteady breath. He looked down at Lily, who was quietly sipping her apple juice, completely unbothered by the violence that had just saturated the room. Sloppy, Toby muttered, repeating the word to the floor. He gently touched Lily's shoulder. Come on, kid. The air in here is toxic. He didn't wait for Dewan's permission. He turned and walked Lily out of the study, leaving the mob boss standing alone behind his desk, staring at the empty doorway. The zipper on the cheap canvas duffel bag caught on a frayed piece of thread. Toby yanked it. The metal teeth grinded, then split apart. Damn it, Toby hissed, his voice trembling. He threw his last faded t-shirt onto the mattress. His hands were shaking violently. The medical-grade suppressants were powerful, but they couldn't entirely filter out the physiological response to a near-death experience. Every time he blinked, he saw the dull black metal of the gun resting against the mahogany desk. He saw the cold, dead emptiness in Dewan's eyes. Toby wasn't a hero. He was a diner waitress who couldn't afford rent. He survived by keeping his head down and ignoring the drug deals in the alleyway behind the dumpsters. Stepping between a mafia capo and a mob boss was the stupidest thing he had ever done. He gripped the edge of the mattress, digging his fingers into the 1,000-thread-count sheets, trying to force oxygen into his lungs. The room smelled sterile. It smelled like money and air conditioning. It felt like a trap. The heavy oak door creaked open. Toby snapped his head up. Dewan stood in the doorway. He had removed his suit jacket and tie. His collar was unbuttoned. He didn't look like an untouchable cartel boss right now. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had just dismantled his own life. Dewan's eyes tracked from Toby's pale, sweating face to the half-packed duffel bag on the bed. A muscle ticked in his jaw. "You're leaving," Dewan said. It wasn't a question. It was a bleak, hollow observation. "Yeah," Toby rasped, shoving the t-shirt into the bag and blindly grabbing for his socks. "I'm leaving. I pour coffee, man. I deal with drunk truckers and burnt hash browns. I don't do guns. I don't do blood." Dewan stepped into the room. The scent of winter air and burnt gunpowder followed him, but it was muted, stripped of its aggressive territorial edge. "Victor will never step foot on this property again. I stripped him of his territory. He is boarding a plane to Palermo tonight. He will not return." Toby laughed. It was a harsh scraping sound. "You think that makes it better? You think exiling a guy makes the gun on your desk disappear? This whole house is built on a powder keg, and I'm not waiting around for the match to strike." He grabbed the broken handles of the duffel bag and hoisted it over his shoulder. He took a step toward the door. Dewan didn't move out of the way. His massive frame blocked the exit completely. "Get out of my way, Dewan!" Toby warned, a genuine note of panic spiking in his voice. His Omega instincts flared, desperate to flee the confined space with the predator. The sharp, distressed scent of crushed cedar broke through the chemical suppressants. Dewan didn't step aside. Instead, he did something that made Toby freeze. De Juan reached around to the small of his back. He pulled out the black semi-automatic pistol. Toby flinched instinctively, taking a step back, his heart slamming against his ribs. But De Juan didn't point it. He ejected the magazine with a sharp click, letting it drop onto the thick carpet. Then he pulled the slide back, ejecting the chambered round. It bounced off the wall and rolled under the bed. De Juan placed the empty gun onto the dresser beside the door. "Carmine is handling the ledger." De Juan set his voice a low, gravelly vibration in the quiet room. He raised his empty hands, palms out. "The ports, the territory. I signed it over an hour ago. I am stepping back." Toby stared at the empty gun, then back up at the Alpha. His brain struggled to process the information. "You... what?" "I am a violent man, Toby." De Juan said the confession ripping out of him without any pretense. The flawless, icy facade was completely gone. His dark eyes were bloodshot and desperate. "I inherited a war. I fought it. I built walls so thick I thought nothing could touch me. And then a stray bullet took my husband, and my daughter stopped speaking." De Juan took a slow, agonizing step forward. He didn't emit dominance. He emitted raw, bleeding grief. "I bought doctors. I bought security. None of it worked." De Juan continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Then you walked in. You smelled like grease and exhaustion, and you didn't care who I was. You bled on my kitchen counter. You sat in the dirt with her. You gave her back to me." Toby stood rooted to the spot, the duffel bag slipping slowly from his shoulder. "You think I'm holding you hostage," De Juan said, stopping just 2 feet away. He looked down at Toby, the height difference suddenly feeling less like a threat and more like a heavy burden the Alpha carried. "But it's the other way around. If you walk out that door, she slips back into the dark, and I will follow her. I have nothing else." The silence in the room was deafening. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade. Toby looked at the terrifying mob boss. He saw the dark circles under his eyes, the slight tremble in his large, scarred hands. De Juan wasn't giving a command. He was begging. Toby slowly let the duffel bag hit the floor. It made a pathetic, muffled thud against the thick carpet. "You're a disaster," Toby whispered, his voice cracking. "Your kitchen appliances are actively trying to murder me. Your friends carry guns. And you smell like a thunderstorm." De Juan's chest hitched. He didn't move, holding his breath, waiting for the final verdict. "But," Toby swallowed hard, looking down at his cheap gray sneakers, then back up into De Juan's dark eyes. I think I'm a disaster, too. And the kid needs someone who knows how to play a proper game of cards." The tension snapped. De Juan closed his eyes. A shudder racked his massive frame. He reached out his hands, hovering awkwardly for a second, before he gently, hesitantly wrapped his arms around Toby's shoulders. It wasn't an Alpha claiming an Omega. It was a drowning man grabbing a lifeline. Toby stiffened for a fraction of a second. Then slowly he let his forehead rest against De Juan's chest. The fabric of the expensive dress shirt smelled intensely of cedar and winter air. It didn't smell like gunpowder anymore. It smelled safe. The kitchen was filled with a dense gray haze. The smoke detector in the hallway let out a series of ear-piercing shrieks. "I've got it! I've got it!" Toby yelled aggressively, waving a scorched oven mitt at the ceiling. He grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet off the industrial stove and shoved it under the running faucet. A massive plume of steam exploded upward, smelling strongly of charred batter. "Jesus, Toby!" a deep voice grumbled from the doorway. Daejuan walked into the kitchen. He was wearing gray sweatpants and a faded black t-shirt. His hair was messy, hanging over his forehead in a way that made him look a decade younger. He walked over to the keypad on the wall and punched in a code, killing the fire alarm instantly. "The stove is too hot," Toby complained, leaning against the counter and rubbing his face. "It's got like a jet engine setting. Who needs to boil water in 4 seconds? People who don't burn pancakes," Daejuan replied dryly. He walked past Toby close enough that their shoulders brushed. The casual, lingering contact sent a quiet hum of warmth down Toby's spine. It had been 2 months since the incident in the study. The transition hadn't been smooth. There were still nightmares. There were still moments where Daejuan's old life cast long, dark shadows over the house. But the suffocating tension was gone. Daejuan opened the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, letting the cool morning breeze push the smoke out into the garden. A small tug on Toby's sweatpants made him look down. Lily stood there. She was wearing a pair of oversized pajamas covered in cartoon dinosaurs. She held a plastic plate up toward him. I know. Toby sighed, grabbing a spatula. He moved to the second skillet, the one that wasn't currently acting as a smoke bomb, and scooped up 3 slightly misshapen but perfectly golden pancakes. He slid them onto her plate. Lily didn't walk away. She stood completely still, staring up at him expectantly. Toby rolled his eyes, a fond, tired smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're a tyrant. You know that." He reached into the pocket of his faded apron. He still wore it. It was a point of stubborn pride. He pulled out a cheap plastic squeeze bottle of generic chocolate syrup. He had forced Carmine to drive to 3 different grocery stores to find the exact brand the diner used. Toby leaned over the counter. His wrist had healed, but his hand still shook slightly, a permanent tremor from the stress and the years of terrible coffee. He squeezed the bottle. A thick dark brown line oozed onto the top pancake. He dragged the nozzle down, curved it, and looped back up. It was a heart, and it was incredibly lopsided. The bottom pooled into a messy blob of chocolate. "Chef's special," Toby muttered, capping the bottle. Lily stared at the plate. She reached out with her index finger, pressed it into the thickest part of the chocolate blob, and tasted it. She scrunched her nose. Then she looked past Toby. She looked at the massive alpha leaning against the granite island, watching them with a quiet, devastatingly soft expression. Lily pointed her chocolate-stained finger at the plate. "Dad," she said. The word dropped into the quiet kitchen, clear and deliberate. It wasn't a hoarse whisper. It was a demand for attention. Daejuan froze. His breath hitched audibly. He pushed off the counter, taking a hesitant step forward, his eyes locked on his daughter. "Dad," Lily repeated, her brow furrowing in deep concentration. She looked down at the pancake, then back up at Daejuan. She pointed her finger directly at the lopsided chocolate heart. "It's still messy." Toby let out a startled, wet bark of laughter. He clapped a hand over his mouth, his eyes immediately welling up with tears. Daejuan didn't laugh. He slowly sank to his knees on the hard tile floor, bringing himself to Lily's eye level. His hands were shaking as he reached out, gently wrapping his large fingers over her small, sticky hand. A single tear broke free, tracking down the alpha's scarred cheek. He didn't bother to wipe it away. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw the light finally burning bright and steady in her dark eyes. "Yeah, Piccola." Juan whispered, his voice thick with a profound, shattering relief. He looked up, catching Toby's tear-filled gray eyes over her head. It's messy, but it's perfect. Toby leaned against the counter, breathing in the scent of burnt sugar, crisp winter air, and the grounding, undeniable smell of home. If you felt the raw emotion in this story, please show your support. This journey of healing brokenness and finding found family in the darkest places was crafted just for you. Don't let this story fade into the background. Smash that like button to let the algorithm know you want more deeply human-grounded Omegaverse dramas. Share this video with a friend who loves slow-burn, gritty romance. And make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter of our storytelling. Your interaction keeps these characters alive. Drop a comment below